short disclaimer before jumping into the podcast. The views and opinions expressed by the interview guests in this podcast are solely their own and do not in any way represent the views, opinions, or positions of any organization with which the guest is or has been affiliated. All statements made by the guest reflect their personal standpoints only. Hi, welcome and grüezi to a new episode of Governance Unplugged. I'm Thomas Michel and I'm thrilled to have you with us for this episode about timeless risks, multi-year assurance and integrated assurance, rethinking the audit lens. In this episode, we will tackle some of the most persistent and in some ways elusive challenges in internal audit. Number one, how can we form meaningful opinions on the risks that don't just spike once, but endure over many years and indeed may be timeless, like cybersecurity, AML, or climate change? Number two, how can we move beyond point-in-time assurance to sometime deeper and more forward-looking? And third and last, how can we make the most of the work of the different line of defense with integrated assurance? Joining me again is Gavin Martin, a seasoned expert in internal audit transformation, having spent more than 30 years in leadership roles in internal audit with some of the largest international banks. Gavin, welcome back.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be back with you, and a big hello to everyone that's listening.
For those of you who would like to hear more about Gavin, please go back to episode 5, where we talked about asking the right questions, how audit committees can better oversee internal audit, where Gavin already provided us with his amazing insights. Let's turn to timeless risks, the ones that don't just fluctuate with quarterly cycles, but over a long period of time. What's your view? How can internal audit offer truly valuable assurance and insights on these long horizon risks? What is your take, Gavin?
Yes, Thomas. I think it's a real challenge, actually. All of these questions that we're going to be dealing with today, really interesting, ones that have been on the minds of me, on my mind, on the minds of internal auditors for some time, and which many individuals, I think, are still grappling with right now and will do for some time to come. I'll just start with a little bit more on timeless risks, because it may not be familiar language to everybody, although I think once we explain it in a little bit more depth, everyone will understand it. For me, what they are those risks that endure over time. They're not going to go away. And also where actually the external threat environment continues to evolve. And so the response to those risks, whether an organization wants to avoid them, accept them, mitigate them, or somehow share those risks, for example, insurance or a joint venture, that also needs to constantly evolve over time to make sure that you are still mitigating those risks in line with risk appetite. You talked about cyber, AML, climate change. I think it's really obvious when you look at something like cyber risk, that threat landscape is constantly evolving. Individuals are finding ever more intricate, clever ways of infiltrating an organization, for example. We've seen recently in the news, retailers in the UK being targeted and ransomware software being deployed to prevent their operations. And being on top of those risks over time is deeply important. That's very different for me from hot risk topics that come up from time to time. Those that deserve a great deal of attention but are unlikely to endure in that form for the long term. A couple of great examples I think that people will be very familiar dealing with recently. COVID. Of course, the threat of a pandemic is out there, but it hits for a period of time, a sustained period of time. But it's not now as forefront of people's minds on a day-to-day basis as it was 3-4 years ago. Another good example is Brexit. It was there for a period of time and companies getting ready for it, knowing that they were prepared. And then once we actually got to the date and the Brexit negotiations were done, then I think organizations moved on relatively quickly with new business approaches. Your question was around, how can we provide insights and maybe be more importantly, foresights on those risks? And for me, I always like to start with the outcome. What is it we're really trying to achieve? What do we want to be able to say to an audit committee about those timeless risks? Clearly, from what I've said, we want to know how the risk and control landscape is changing over time. What's the maturity of the landscape compared to, some sort of a benchmark? That might be COSO, it might be our best practice knowledge from the industry. And if I give a quick example here again on anti-money laundering, you actually want to know as well where you are compared with other organizations in that maturity. External people that might want to exploit weaknesses tend to look for the weakest participant in a particular industry. So you need to know where you are against those other organizations if you don't want to be the weakest industry participant and the one that's targeted. Whilst individual audits are clearly important because they bring a picture of something that's going on at a point in time, for me, they're not as important on these topics as the top-down view that you're trying to create. What is that overall picture of that risk and control landscape? And the analogy I've used here before with my teams and others in the profession is the difference between photos and a film. So often in audit, we are producing photos, or if you want, the cells, individual cells from a film that are created, those point-in-time snapshots that give you a picture, and we might have many of them that we could lay out on a table and show people about all of those point-in-time snapshots. And maybe the conversation for the audit committee is something along the lines of, from all of those pictures over the last 12 months, some things got better, some things stayed the same, and some things got worse. But that doesn't really help them as they're trying to tackle the conversation of, so where are we as a result of those, some things getting better, some things staying the same, and some things getting worse? What you need is the film, something much more about the story over time. These parts of the control framework are more mature than we've seen in the past. Maybe they're at the top of the maturity scale for today, more mature than other organizations. Whereas these parts of the control framework, whilst we've seen good progress, are still behind. And that for me is, super important to be able to have that broader context. And without it, I think it is really hard for both internal audit and the audit committee to know whether overall the picture is getting better, staying the same, or worse, or even which parts of the picture are getting better, staying the same, or are worse.
I really like this analogy with the movie and the picture, and basically movies, at least in the old days, they were like a series of pictures. It changed a tiny little bit, I guess in the current times. But what could get in the way of internal auditors or an internal department providing such views already?
I think for me, Thomas, it's a great question, what gets in the way? Really, for me, I think annual planning can actually get in the way of some of this. The desire to create the plan for a year, having those audits that happen at a point in time, that can get in the way if you don't have this broader picture in mind. And I think back to some of my earlier career leading portfolios of audit work and some of the topics I touched on. On the biggest ones, what was really important was to have a single page where I had the different components that I was trying to audit. It was actually the life cycle that customer transactions could go through. And knowing which audits I had and which parts of that life cycle they attached to, and at what points in time would I have enough of a view on those individual components to say something about the objectives for that component. I mean, a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle. I sort of knew the overall picture, and it was where I was fitting in individual pieces to give me greater clarity. And so I knew for this part of the annual plan, that's where I'm going to bring a bit of the picture into sharper focus and be able to say something. And afterwards, here's where I need to have it. At the same time, what goes on is that picture changes, the risks change. And so maybe my sharp picture was useful 3 months ago, and as something happens, it no longer is so useful. And I need to go back and do some more works and sharpen up that image, find additional pieces of the puzzle. But knowing that the overall picture will keep evolving, my views on it will keep evolving, and I might be using that same tool over 3 years, 5 years to communicate my messages. But all of those individual pictures are helping me play some sort of much longer term story.
Taking that thought a little bit further, so we often provide annual opinions or one-off observations to our stakeholders. But what would it take for an internal audit department to offer a multi-year view? Sometimes that helps boards or executive committees to connect the dots over time.
I think the temptation that I sort of sense the moment that we say, let's get a multi-year view, is to immediately reach for something and say, let's have a multi-year plan. Because if we map out what we're going to do over the next 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, we'll get a complete picture. I think in a number of these areas, though, the risks evolve too quickly. And so it's a bit of a wasted effort to be pulling that together when in 6 months' time, in 12 months' time, we'll have a different view. So I would absolutely maintain that this is the landscape today that I might need to audit over a multi-year period. Here are the parts which are really pressing for me to get to now. Ideally, over time, I'm going to build up the whole picture, but I know that those components are going to move around, and I'm going to want to look at different aspects over time. What I mustn't forget, though, is what are my real underlying hypotheses? What are some of the messages I want to be able to take over the components of that picture and say, look, I've looked at all of, I don't know, the client onboarding processes, for example. And I think that the organization is mature, control framework, the risk landscape is mature, and I think it is, comparing to other organizations, mature. And at this moment in time, I feel good about it, but we'll keep our antenna out there to see whether something shifts over time. So at some point, you need to be delivering the opinions on the component parts, even if not delivering all opinions on all components at one time.
That's a really interesting point, Gavin. Over the past few years, there's been a clear shift in conversations. Many moved away from long-term audit planning, arguing that in such a volatile and fast-changing world, long-term plans just don't make sense anymore. But I fully agree with your perspective. It's not about choosing one over the other. What we really need is a thoughtful balance, a clear long-term vision and a strategic direction combined with the ability to act decisively in the present. As an internal auditor, we should absolutely know where we want to go and what aim we want to achieve. At the same time, we must remain agile, open-minded, and ready to pivot whenever there are new risks or issues emerging. It's about building a strong, capable team that can execute on the plan while staying flexible enough to respond quickly and effectively to whatever comes our way.
Yeah. I think if I went back to where I really had one of these big, it was actually an A3 sheet of paper size map of what it was I was accountable for auditing. And the big question I started with were, what are all of the opinions I could give over this end-to-end framework that would be useful? And those opinions changed over time. Actually, in this moment, the most useful opinion I could give would be something different because the risks outside of the organization had shifted, or there was a different focus. But by having that, what are all of the opinions I could give? I could then prioritize which were the most important ones to give at this moment in time, in the next 3 months, in the next 6 months, that would be most useful. But not lose sight of what opinions have I not yet given. And that, I think, is a really helpful tool that is, well, I haven't given these ones this year. They weren't the biggest priority. but maybe they are for me to give next year. And I know that next year might be different, and I might change my view, and the business might change what it's doing. But at any point in time, I could see, has it gone too long without me giving an opinion on an important part of this framework? I don't know. Maybe it's about preventing bad actors getting into the organization. Maybe it's about detecting once they're in there, swiftly that someone's got in, and then preventing them getting from system to system. I don't know what those different components might be in every scenario, but having them really makes you step back and think, are all my individual pieces of work really joined up for me to give those opinions at a point in time? And am I happy at, by giving that opinion at that point in time?
So in essence, it's not just measuring where the organization is today, but we as auditors connecting the dot and understanding where is it heading.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I bring back in this concept of the maturity of the control framework, I think it's really useful here to have some sort of benchmark that you're holding the organization against, from basic control framework to advanced control frameworks, and being able to describe clearly where it is. That's something you should put in place up front and talk to the business about, and it acts as a really good tool for pushing the organization forward, influencing them, and particularly a good tool in seeing where, as the external landscape changes, whilst nothing has changed in the internal control framework, you've gone backwards.
Okay, let's bring it home with a big one. How do we evolve from point-in-time assurance to continuous insights? Point-in-time assurance still dominates much of our internal audit work as we talk today, but in a world of continuous risks, is that model still fit for purpose? How do we evolve?
And I think, Thomas, a lot of people often start talking about continuous auditing. And for me, it's probably good just to touch on what I think that means for internal audit and what it doesn't mean from my perspective. There's a bit of a temptation, I think, for audit to find some interesting things that they can discover what first-line management haven't seen. And there is a real role for audit here. Audit functions often smaller, quite nimble, able to do some things that are interesting and innovative, really understand risk and control. And so we may well be able to identify things that the business hasn't seen. But the reality of that work, it is management's day-to-day monitoring. And so wherever we do that, we should have in mind that we want to hand that over back to the business in a safe way, with them taking full ownership for those controls, so they can see live day-to-day what's happening, what things they need to be looking at. For me, when we talk about the continuous auditing, it is really trying to identify where the organization might be under stress. It is stress points that result in there being issues from my experience. That could be, increased sales in a particular area and there's too many things to process through the existing systems. It could be a committee that was meant to be made up of senior individuals and now is staffed entirely by deputies, and maybe they don't all know exactly what their role is, how they should be doing that role. It could be in parts of the organization where senior individuals have left. They're not around anymore, and lots of the work is falling onto an ever-decreasing number of individuals, and they've actually got too many things to do. Identifying those stress points and going and seeing, has that been seen by the first line? Maybe that's attending a committee and seeing, is it in their deck of information? Are they discussing it? If yes, brilliant. Management are spotting their own risks as they come along. I love that. Then you can move on to the question, how are they responding? And are we happy they're responding in the right way? Again, if yes, brilliant. That's the control framework working. But obviously it might be that we see, I don't think first line has seen these risks. Or they have seen them, but I don't think they're reacting in a way I'd expect them to react. And that's the real opportunity for audit to be thinking about, do I challenge live and the situation changes? Do I need to put some sort of audit work on the plan in order to highlight these matters and bring them to attention? But there's something there to be able to say, how can we bring to light these emerging risks as they come along? And that, for me, is providing continuous insight. So I would love a world where auditors don't feel the need to go along to every committee meeting that's happening to work out what's going on, but they've got data that allows them to work out which ones it would be most useful for them to go and observe, because there are specific things that they're trying to determine, has this already been spotted by first line of defense, second line of defense, and therefore there's nothing for us to need to be involved with at this stage.
So the goal is audit being in the right place at the right time to see how management at the second line are responding to risks and providing opinions more quickly when and where it matters.
For me, absolutely. Getting yourself in the right place at the right time. I'll bring in here one of the other things that I've often thought about, Thomas, which is a doctor-patient type analogy. And I've wondered about this. Maybe it's as I get older and there's a need to visit the doctor more often. I always thought it would be quite interesting, wouldn't it, in today's age, if my doctor had access to way more of the real live information. I might turn up there and the doctor does some tests, point-in-time audits, if you want, of my health, blood pressure, some blood tests, and find some results. But how much better would it be if my doctor had access to my smartwatch, my heart rate monitoring, and actually could see at some point the real stress point that's going on for me, and get in touch with me and said, I've looked at the data and I'm a bit concerned at what's happening overnight with your sleep patterns. Come and have a conversation. And it might be that he discovers that I'm fully aware of what's going on and says there's nothing for me to intervene with. Or it might be that the doctor says, actually, there's something for us to look at here in a little bit more depth. And so I like that. I could take it even further. What if they could see my driving style? There's plenty of things that could end up with us being in hospital if they took data from our cars and said, yeah, I can see that you drive too fast. I can see that some of that is late at night. Maybe you're at risk of falling asleep at the wheel or not paying enough attention. This is equally something that could end up with me in hospital and might be an interesting conversation of, have you noticed these risks and how are you taking care of them yourself?
Great way to compare this. So if we talk about integrated assurance, or in other terms, collaborating across the three lines of defense, in today's complex risk environment, no single function has the full picture or the full overview. That's why integrated assurance, combining insights from the first, second, and third line of defense, is more important than ever. But what does true collaboration across the three lines actually look like? How can internal audit help orchestrate a more connected, holistic assurance landscape without compromising its independence? And are we speaking the same technical language when it comes to fundamentals like sampling or benchmarking?
Yeah, it's quite a lot in there, Thomas. But I think absolutely right to have all of those different component parts. I think integrated assurance gets talked about a lot. And we should probably just set out for some of the people listening, some of our perspectives around what it is and what it isn't. I already mentioned a bit that for me, continuous auditing isn't us stepping into the role of the first line. It might be helpful to do some of those tests to show the results and to hand over and to show how first line monitoring can be better. And for me, integrated assurance is not moving from three lines of defense to there only being one line of defense, because we say, well, the first line's got it covered, and therefore the second and the third line don't need to have a look. The three lines of defense is really important for having those different lenses. The day-to-day on-the-job monitoring, the point-in-time work that's not fully independent, undertaken by a second line, and then that point-in-time monitoring that is undertaken independently from a third line. And for me, integrated assurance is how can each subsequent line of defense really leverage the work that was done by the earlier lines of defense without, importantly for the third line, compromising independence. And that is, understanding the work that is done, the scoping, understanding the methodologies, having common methodologies so you don't trip over problems like you talked about risks in this way, we talk about risks in another way, and really being able to leverage that work to get to some sort of combined picture. And that combined picture, I used the example in one of our previous podcasts of school playground football. It might work with other sports, but this was my experience when I was younger, that everybody chasing the football on one part of the pitch and nearly impossible to get the ball out of that area to the open space. For me, the benefits of integrated assurance is you can check that we don't have everybody playing in one part of the risk landscape and nobody looking somewhere else. It's about having the right focus from each of the lines of defense across all parts of the risk landscape, knowing when it's happening so you don't trip each other up, and being really thoughtful about, working together closely to get it right.
I'm a big fan of integrated assurance, but to tell the truth, it's a term that gets thrown around quite a bit. Based on your opinion, or more importantly, your experience, how does integrated assurance look like in practice?
Yeah, I think it is often a real challenge because, each line of defense is very busy, and finding the extra time to really have the conversations about how do we get to a consolidated picture. But again, I come to having a good conversation with people about the outcome. How good would it be if as 3 lines of defense we were able to tell one story to the organization about how we are comfortable that we are achieving the strategic objectives in line with risk appetite. And when I say one story, that doesn't necessarily mean to say that all the component parts of the story agree. There is a really healthy thing about the fact that we're telling a story about the same part of the risk and control landscape, an objective that the organization is trying to achieve. And we might have slightly different perspectives on how well that is being done. But there's a real benefit in having debates about those differences of opinion. I've had those in the past. A part of the organization says, you raised findings, Gavin, on us, and we've implemented all those findings. We think we're good. You're still saying that we're not quite there. And I said, yeah, absolutely, because I haven't yet validated that, from my perspective, all of the issues we've raised have closed. And I think there might be a couple of things that have gone wrong along the way. And so we could actually have a real discussion about, was it a timing difference between the difference in our story, or were there some other factors coming into play that would mean we had a different opinion on the overall risk and control landscape?
So it's much less about merging functions and so much more about aligning perspectives to close blind spots.
Absolutely. I'd say another thing as to why it doesn't necessarily always work in organizations, Thomas, at this point, which is, if you set out with an objective of let's have integrated assurance across all aspects, that can be a very big thing to try and achieve. And it quickly gets into conversations about whether we should have one shared platform, one shared risk and control system, one taxonomy across the entire organization, one set of control language, one set of risk language, exactly the same methodologies. They are all important questions and absolutely could help you get to integrated assurance. But I think it would be really interesting just taking one of the timeless risks and starting out by saying, wouldn't it be great to have a consolidated view across the first, second, and third lines of defense about how we're dealing with cyber risk? Starting there And it might be that everyone says this would be so much better if we had one system. And maybe the need for that will come out of those conversations, and the energy and the desire for building it will come out. And for me, that's the real difference between, maybe getting people theoretically to agree with you from a mind perspective, what you're saying is right, and actually really engaging the heart where they say, we really need to be able to do this because it is transformative for an organization.
Bringing it back to our home turf, if integration is the destination, perhaps orchestration is internal audit's role. But that raises a big question: how can we help coordinate a holistic cross-functional view of risk and assurance without losing the independence that defines us? What is your take, Gavin? How can internal audit drive alignment across the lines while staying objective, credible, and independent?
Yeah, as I've said, I think, Thomas, one of the real features of internal audit typically being one of the smaller functions in an organization. It's typically smaller than the risk and compliance functions, typically smaller than the first line business in terms of the numbers of individuals, is just how nimble internal audit can be. Audit also has access to all of the individuals across the organization, in my experience. So as a smaller, nimble function with that access, I think audit is ideally placed to act as an agitator for the change and can really help shift the emphasis away from maybe problems that stop an organization to getting to this point to the outcome and what it would look like if that outcome was in place. And maybe in individual areas, those small steps that I talked about, one area taking the lead and saying, for this subject, wouldn't it be good if first, second, third line were presenting jointly their views together to the committees and it all tied together? I know that happens in a number of organizations. I think it is so powerful. But yeah, if people wanted to start on this and they're thinking about how to do it, I'd say, pick an area and go for it. And once you found out what works, replicate it. And I think you'll get the energy and the enthusiasm for making the change from approaching it in that way. But you celebrate successes along the way, absolutely, as well, with across all lines. There's a huge energy to be got from people when they can see progress is being made.
And by taking on this orchestration role, internal audit doesn't just enhance coordination, it also reinforces the credibility of the overall assurance message.
And absolutely. And, throughout all of this, it allows audit to maintain their independent view. When I say bring one view, it's one view of first line's view. It's one view of second line's view, one view of third line's view together. And there may be differences, and the differences are healthy. Those differences of viewpoint are where the richness of a discussion can lie.
That brings me straight to the next point. You're reading my mind, Gavin. Are we really speaking the same technical language across the lines, especially when it comes to things such as sampling or benchmarking? And if we talk technical for a moment, we often assume that if each line is doing its own reviews, the board is well covered. But if you're not aligned on the fundamentals, the picture doesn't quite add up. And how important is it, in your view, that the first, second, and third line apply consistent methodologies when it comes to the core principles?
I think it's vital, and I think your choice of words, Thomas, around aligned is really important. And for me, I don't actually see that aligned means doing exactly the same thing, maybe exactly the same risk and control language. I can work quite happily with a first line business having a more granular control language than, say, internal audit, or a more granular risk language. What's important is how they aggregate up. A real problem comes if different parts of the organization think risks live under fundamentally different taxonomies. Then it is really hard to get the things aggregated to be able to give a consistent view, because different lines of defense put those risks in different places of a risk taxonomy, and that just leads to confusion. So for me, I'd say, as aligned as possible on a risk taxonomy, maybe different granularities, as aligned as possible on control languages, as aligned as possible on sampling approaches. So at least if the third line is looking to rely on the second line, The reason for not doing it is, well, we think about sampling very differently. That's a real shame, aligned on what a maturity of a control framework looks like, because otherwise when you come to benchmarking maturity, you'll automatically have a different answer, not because you necessarily view the world differently, but you're using a different thing to compare them against. And that doesn't help. And that doesn't help the senior governance bodies.
Yeah, I can understand. But just to double that down, so even something as basic as what is a representative sample needs to have cross-line agreement.
Absolutely. I mean, otherwise what you're going to discover is when audit tries to rely on a second line of defense, for example, maybe the first finding that they come up with is they don't think the second line of defense is choosing representative samples. And so, it's quite unhelpful to be having those sorts of conversations when that could have been solved upfront.
Let's zoom out to the bigger picture as we wrap up. From your experience, what really makes integrated assurance efforts succeed and what holds them back? What are the key enablers you've been seeing, and just as importantly, the common traps organizations should avoid?
Yeah, I think what's really clear is to have a common goal, where I think this has worked for me in the past. I mean, I talked about that one big picture that I had. That was a picture I shared across the second line and the first line about how I viewed their business, and it was one that they looked at and they bought into. I shared as well what were the different audit opinions I could give over those different phases, and double-checked what it was they thought about that. And what was really helpful about that was there was a common understanding and a common goal to what really the first line of defense was trying to achieve strategically for the business, what role the second line played in trying to achieve that strategically, and what role the third line played in trying to achieve that strategically. And so once you've got that common goal that we're all working together to see whether the organization achieves its strategic objectives in line with risk appetite, and we play our different parts, then you can easily, stitch together the work that is done across the different lines of defense. I mean, in that scenario, I actually think it was possible that the first line could have reduced the amount of work it was doing. There were opportunities in the sampling to do less sampling on the right things, and it would have overall reduced the amount of work. And that would have still been fine for the second line and would have been fine for internal audit as well in terms of what needed to be done.
So would it be fair to say that at the end of the day, integration is not just about the structure, it's about the mindset and the way of thinking?
Absolutely. For me, so much more about the mindset. And I think, Thomas, for me, if I was bringing in a different analogy, I talked about the small steps on this, and the example I was giving was about one particular risk topic where I had those conversations. And if you're trying to set off now to discover the world and what it looked like, we'd probably do very similar to what was done in the past of go and find out the picture for one area to start with, and then once we were successful, go and map out a part of another part of the world. And I really encourage teams to set off with that mindset. Maybe a smaller step that is achieved and then encourages other small steps to be achieved is a way to build the overall picture from the bottom up successfully, rather than trying to tackle the whole picture all in one go.
Gavin, thank you once again for such a rich and practical conversation. It was truly insightful to listen and learn from you. So much of what you shared resonates deeply with my own experiences and beliefs. As we wrap up, is there one key thing that you would like our listeners to take away from today's conversation? Whether on timeless risks, multi-year assurance, or integrated assurance, what would it be?
It's pick an area. Start with a small step, pick an area, get the right people together, get agreed on the outcomes that you're all trying to achieve, and look to be successful on that one area. See what works, and then replicate that across other subjects if it's important. And if you're picking one of those timeless risks to do it on, what a great place to start, because you know you're going to need to continue to have that picture, not just this year, but next year, the year after, and the year after that. So I don't think there is wasted effort and energy from any of the lines of defense in pulling that together.
Thank you so much, Gavin. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. I hope this episode gave you a fresh perspective on timeless risks, multi-year assurance, integrated assurance, and rethinking Audit's lens. Make sure to subscribe to Governance Unplugged, and if there are topics you would like to be explored or a guest you would like to hear from, drop me a message on LinkedIn or visit www.keystone-governance.ch. And as always, together, let's build stronger, more resilient organizations, one conversation at a time. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep driving governance excellence.